Merry Christmas. You are listening to Inside the Hive on the All Hornets podcast network. One podcast feed with multiple shows, making sure we cover the Charlotte Hornets from every angle. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review. The All Hornets podcast network is affiliated with the Fans First Sports podcast group. Today's show, I'm joined by Richie Randall from Buzzbeat Podcast, and we're going to be creating our blame pie chart for this season to try and allocate who we think is most responsible for the disappointing season that's been so far. Richie, we're recording this before Christmas, but people will probably be listening to this sometime after Christmas. So I hope everyone's had a great time over the holiday period. And how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. I was kind of chatting with you pre-recording about the struggle with Buzzbeat right now in terms of the content. And I think this specific topic that we're going to discuss today should be pretty interesting.
Yeah, like I say, we've been trying to find creative ways to cover the team. And this is a nice little piece of evergreen content, which there's a lot of blame going around, right? We've seen it. We see it during the games. We see it during some of these press releases. And we've not shared here in terms of how we've allocated our blame. And I'll just quickly, for the listeners so you know, we have 4 sections: coaching, front office, players, and luck. And we have created assigned percentages to each one of those areas. And now this is specifically for this season.
Yeah.
But obviously some of these things like have ties back. So especially the front office, some things might have happened in the past which are impacting the season. But you'll go along with us here. You know, you can get the idea by here. And we're going to have a nice graphic on social media once it's been out a couple of days where we'll show our different pie charts. I guess firstly, Richie, this is something that neither of us done before. How did you find the process of trying to assign percentage blame to these 4 different areas?
Well, the first thing I did was just rank the 4 in terms of which one I thought was the most heavily, blameworthy. And I'm not going to lie, it was a little bit of arbitrary numbers that I kind of threw out there. Like I knew that my biggest one probably had, over half of the blame, and just kind of worked my way from there. But it was an interesting process. I think they're all connected in a certain way. I think one of them kind of affects the others. And then the one about the luck is interesting because that is almost like outside factors, which is sometimes hard to judge, which, you can't discount by any means. But it was an interesting little exercise here. And the first thing I did was just kind of rank them and then go add percentages to them.
That's a great process. I wish I had something as structured as that. I just sat down and started making scribbles, basically.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to say we've not shared what we've got. As you're the guest, Richie, I will let you choose where we start. And I will also say that I'm not wedded to my percentages. And maybe through the arc of this conversation, I reserve the right to change my mind as we go and we have these discussions. So let me know where you would like to start.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and start with the front office because that's the biggest chunk of mine. I don't know if it's the biggest chunk of yours, and maybe I'm giving a little bit too much blame in terms of the overall percentage. I'm very heavy on the first 2 that I have. The last 2 are a little bit lower in percentages. So maybe it's not fair. Obviously, it can't be 25, 25, 25, 25, but I assign 55% to the front office. So over half. Is that a little heavy?
We're literally matched up. That's why I'm laughing. I have 55% against front office. Exactly the same. Even the 5% for us to get in there.
I originally had 50, but I wanted to bump it over 0.5% and then just kind of work my way from there. But so yeah, let's start here. Let's start here with the front office. I do think that this deserves the bulk of the blame, and maybe as we talk through it, we can go up or down with it. But 55 seems like a good starting point. And you mentioned at the top of this podcast that we're trying to isolate it to this season and this season alone. But I think this is the one category that has the most connection to past seasons and obviously future seasons, how they set up for that. So I'm going to refrain from going too far back and kind of focus on the offseason. I think Mitch Kupchak has proven to me that he has been unable to build a roster that, 1, plays both sides of the ball, 2, can have any kind of depth. And then the players that they need to hold on to, it seems like he just can't. I think, if we're going to go just recency in the offseason here with DSJ, losing him for so little, not prioritizing him in the offseason, to keep him as a backup point guard really has proven to be a trend with this organization. They just can't hold on to guys that, even if it's on a short contract, they kind of show some signs of life. And obviously DSJ has some offensive limitations, but the impact that he had on the offensive end is, pressuring the rim and dishing out to shooters. I think most importantly, he's a guy that plays on the defensive side of the court, and that would be very beneficial for this team right now. Not only because they don't have individual defenders that can play that way, but, if he were to pair up with LaMelo, had, LaMelo been healthy right now, those two can pair up pretty well. I also think Mitch Kupchak has shown like no urgency to kind of trade any of the guys who have been like taking up a larger chunk of the salary cap, which obviously is a bit challenging to do at times, but it's almost like he waits to the last possible minute and the value continues to decrease. And they know that maybe the Hornets are desperate to get rid of some of these guys. Like, for example, the Plumlee trade last year, they got a second round pick out of it. Could they have got more? Maybe 2 seconds, maybe a player at least, but.
And Jalen McDaniels was the same. I think they gave up a second even in the Jalen McDaniels. I know they got 2 back, but they gave up 1, didn't they? In that one, I believe.
So. Yeah. So I just feel like it's a last second decision. We saw the signs of Mark Williams playing well last year. You just get rid of Plumlee sooner rather than later. And I fear that's what's going to happen with Rozier if that's the route they want to take, and or Hayward if that's the route they want to take. So that's kind of what I want to get at first. Yeah.
Your first thing there, you said like it felt last second that they're reacting. This is what Mitch Kupchak said after the trade deadline last year. The trade deadline is something you don't spend a lot of time on. And then an hour before the trade deadline, you have to make decisions and decide what you want to do. You start the season with an open mind, blah, blah, blah. But like he basically said outright, it's not something you spend a lot of time on. And then the hour before the deadline, you have to make decisions. Now, I don't know if like that's just Mitch trying not to answer something too directly and like then making a mistake. But like that is just an outward, admission that it's not like they're working the phones. It does not sound like with the strategy on how to move these guys as the time goes along. So I don't think that's a feeling. I think Mitch Kupchak essentially admitted to that at the end of last season at the trade deadline.
I feel like his messaging just in general has been confusing. And it's a lot of times it's just to appease the fans, appease the media, because there's been times when he said that like this team can't draft for need. They need talent. And then shortly after, leading up to the season, he's like, yeah, this team can make the playoffs. So like, which one is it? Like, do they have enough talent to make the playoffs or do they not have enough talent?
And he also said last year, this team is too shallow, and he took responsibility for that post-trade deadline. So he said before this free agency, this team needs more veteran presence, more leadership, which that was music to everybody's ears. And, outside of the addition of maybe Brandon Miller, they lost Kelly Oubre, added Miles Bridges, like similar position players. This team is not unbelievably deeper. In fact, it's actually shallower when you look at the center position, the backup point guard position. And they never really who was your veteran leader that they've added? I know Ish Smith, they added, the day before the season. You can't tell me that was the team's plan all along. If that was the team's veteran leader that they envisioned, then you would have had him earlier in the summer in free agency. So I agree what you said, that he has identified some of the issues that we all know. We all know on paper, look at the team, what the issues are. And the front office have failed to address those issues year on year. And I think last year, injuries maybe hid some of the underlying issues. You could hide behind, we weren't healthy. We didn't get to see our playing groups. But I think reading between the lines last year, we could see there was major issues in terms of especially the defensive side of the ball and how these pieces complemented each other. And they wanted to see it all together. And we still haven't, right? That would be Mitch Kupchak's defense right here to say we've still not seen the starting unit that we wanted to see, which had Miles Bridges included, LaMelo Ball, Mark Williams, I think outside of a quarter and a half against Orlando. We can't say anything to say that lineup won't work because we have not seen it. But we've seen enough of each of those players and we know the skill sets, I think, to make an educated guess that I don't think that group is solving all the problems that exist going across this roster.
Yeah. When I step back and you're right, like they have not, he's not had the benefit of having these guys play consistently, and these playing groups, if you want to factor in the luck, we'll talk about that later, has not been on the Hornets side. But when I step back and look at this roster, it is very spotty the deeper you get, like you mentioned. The construction of this roster is so heavily dependent on the starters and maybe one or two bench guys. But most of the bench guys that the Hornets are playing right now, like the 7th, 8th, 9th men, like I would think on most teams, most playoff teams, they would be getting DNPs. They would be playing minimal minutes. And that's really what it comes down to. I just think that the depth of this team, because it's so dependent on the top guys like Rozier, Hayward, LaMelo, PJ Washington, and when those guys go down, there's no depth. And obviously you've got constraints that you've got to work with the salary cap and all that. But, it just seems like some teams are able to withstand injuries. The Hornets are not able to withstand injuries. And I think that speaks to an overall, lack of construction with the roster. And, you can point to his drafting history. Like, I think it's been up and down. I think there's been some highs, some lows. I think this past season, if we want to keep it recent, Brandon Miller seems to be the correct move. But we probably won't know the true answer to that, until like 2 to 4 seasons down the road. The Bridges thing is interesting to me too. Like from a basketball standpoint, I understand why Mitch kept him around, because you just can't lose the asset. From a PR perspective, they would have cut ties with him a long time ago. So, who knows how long Mitch is going to stay around. I think, we've given him enough time to kind of figure out what he's good at and what he's been, failing to do. And the team also just lacks size, like at the 2 and 3 position as well. Like, for defensive measures, and a lot of opposing teams target like Terry Rozier just because of the lack of size. I don't know. I just feel like this roster, a lot of the players are just play on one side of the court. Like if you were to name a two-way player on the Hornets, like who comes to mind? Like Hayward and PJ, but they're not really like outstanding.
No, I wouldn't say they are plus defenders. I would say they're like average. But yeah, you're talking two-way player. You could argue. I mean, coaches seem to love Terry's defense. I'm a little bit less sold on it than they are, but I feel like he's maybe a guy who's locked into the game plan well. Shows people to where they should be shown on the court. He isn't out there like jumping off the film defensively, but he's maybe the guy. But yeah, I agree with you. There is not a lot of two-way players, despite that's what everyone's talking about. But I think the other thing is this team is just soft, right? They've drafted a lot of guys for talent, a lot of freshmen coming out of college, even looking at, JT Thor, Amari Bailey, Nick Smith Jr., Bryce McGowan's when he got drafted a lot of first-year guys who are, naive, just like in a basketball sense. I mean, just like don't have that much experience and have never like had to build that physicality. And this team just gets bullied. I mean, we saw it against the Pelicans with Jonas Valanciunas. It doesn't matter who you play. If there is anyone who is like physical, they will just either get fouled or have their like all the time in the world getting to the rim. So very interesting. We have front office exactly the same at 55%. I can't believe we've actually landed on the same place there. I'm with you. I think we all saw coming into the season like that backup point guard, backup center, like third string center was going to be an issue that you surely feel that with a veteran player. And they didn't really do that. Frank Ntilikina, I know we've not seen him. He was supposed to be the answer, but I'm still not convinced. Even when we see him, he is really a point guard. I think he's like an interesting, like 3-and-D spacing off-ball player, but I'm just not convinced. And I wasn't from what I saw in preseason either of those lead point guard duties. So matched up on our front office being the main culprit here. Anything else on that, or do we move on to the next section?
The last thing I'll mention, but I guess it's still part of the front office. Like, I'm not trying to excuse anything that Mitch has done, but you do have to wonder. I know that MJ is now not a majority owner anymore, but you do have to wonder about his influence on some of these moves over the course of his tenure. But again, that's still kind of classified front office. So I guess that doesn't really change my percentage.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely think, look, the big decisions, Michael Jordan is involved in these. There's one thing that we've learned by now. So I completely agree. All right, next on, let's go on to your second section. You said this was relatively large again compared to the other two.
Compared to I don't know. It's double the other two. I'm going to players as my second one at 25%. That doesn't match up to yours, does it?
I'm at players for 30%.
Okay.
So again, we are very close, very much in the same ballpark.
So yeah, I've got them accounted for a fourth of the blame. You could just go down the list of players and just kind of like think this season, how many players have shown improvement? How many players have regressed? How many players have kind of stayed the same? And I just don't see a ton of improvement from the players, and the accountability rest on their shoulders. I mean, obviously, we just mentioned that the roster construction isn't ideal, but that doesn't prevent players from stagnating. Doesn't prevent them from trying to get better. I think LaMelo and I guess Rozier to a certain extent are one of the two players that I can kind of think of that have noticeably improved in a handful of aspects. You know, you've got LaMelo who gets to the rim a little bit more, draws more fouls. Rozier has, taken up his role as LaMelo's been out. He's elevated his three-point efficiency back to where it was after a down year last year. His scoring is much needed. His clutch shooting is much needed. And he's just doing it with a more prominent role. But when you look at the other players, like I can almost point to almost every single player on the roster that has not gotten better, or there's something that's like popped up that's new that I'm like, wow, like I didn't realize that was now a deficiency of yours. Like PJ Washington, for example, he has disappointed me this year with his on-ball defense, and it just hasn't popped like it has in seasons past. Like he had a very solid start to the season, but he's been inconsistent since like the first 5 or 6 games. Mark Williams, for example, like we've had discussions about this. I'm sure you guys have had as well, like getting pushed around by more physical bigs. I would have thought he would have shown something this season that I can point to that stands out. Like, wow, that's a noticeable improvement from Mark Williams. And that's not to say that I'm not on board with him, but like,
I actually think he's regressed defensively from what I saw last season. I mean, I was so impressed how he used to not jump at pump fakes, and then this year he's got in foul trouble like time and time again. Whereas something last year that felt like he was really locked in on and wasn't as much of an issue. And obviously it was different for him coming in from the G League and playing later in the year. But I think offensively he's been kind of impressed me. I think exceeded my expectations. But defensively, which is a thing where everyone pegged him in, he just doesn't influence other team around the rim as often as you thought he would, I think, from the flashes that we saw last year.
Yeah, and I think the physicality stands out to me, getting pushed around. To your point, he's trying to jump for all the blocks that he can get, and that gets him into trouble with the fouls. One thing that we saw last year was him being a little bit more versatile in the pick and roll situation, but we're seeing a little bit more conservative approach with him and drop, and obviously recently he's been injured. JT Thor has been another disappointment to me. I don't know what you feel about him. Like, he has regressed on both ends of the court. Bridges has fallen off since his hot start. And I would say like Nick Richards and Hayward, like they haven't necessarily gotten like tremendously better. But I would just say they've kind of been like flatline to me, like both of those guys. But, besides LaMelo, besides Rozier, a lot of the other guys just have not shown enough to me. And there's only so much blame you can put on like the roster construction. You've got to kind of overcome that and be a little bit better individually. But that's kind of how I view it. 25% for these players.
Well, everyone says the summer is where you get better, right? That's the phrase that goes around players. That's where you can work with your skill coaches, improve your shooting percentages, improve your ball handling, work and getting in better shape, or improving your athleticism. When you're in the season, you don't have as much time to work on your craft as much, just because you'll play, recover. And I agree with you. Like, there was the game of the night. I think I tweeted this, that you were going to see Nick Smith Jr., Bryce McGowan's, JT Thor. I remember in years past, if we'd have seen like first and second year's player hitting the floor, you're like your eyes are pinned to the TV, right? Because you're excited to see glimpses of these guys who've been hidden on the bench, and you want to see how they're developing. And there's just no excitement about this team's young players. It's just like, oh, great. Like they're going to come in and we're probably going to be outscored by 10, and it's going to be a real struggle. And there is just no mystery, intrigue, I don't think, apart from like with Nick Smith Jr. He is the only one that I feel that kind of level of anticipation exists. And someone like Nick Smith Jr., there's been a couple of times last year when he really hustles. He plays hard. You can see him like running up the floor hard, playing with like high energy. And it really jumps off the page. And then I realized why it jumps off so much is because there's just not many players in the Hornets who play with that like level of verve and hop in their step like he does. And sometimes it ends up with fouls. But you don't describe any of these Charlotte Hornets players like high energy, active, defensive disruptors. I just don't think they play all that tough. I talked about it in the front office side, they got soft players. I think the players have to take some responsibility. Like, one night turnovers is the issue, the next it's defensive rebounding, then the next night it's the fouls, then they can't shoot the ball from three. There is no real consistency, I don't think, from any of the players as a collective group. But the one thing that's consistent is they generally get pushed around and bullied by veteran teams. And like, there's only so long you can keep wishing and saying, well, they're going to mature, they're going to get stronger. At some point, like these young guys, like you're not saying that about the Oklahoma City Thunder. And a lot of their players are in their first and second and third year. So that is something that I don't think these players have taken on. And Steve Clifford has tried to protect them. He said that they're playing hard. The effort is not the problem. And I think, yes, that's right at times. But you can't tell me you watch all the games this year and don't notice low energy periods or when the team have given up or when there's like 5 people standing around watching Kyle Lowry grab an offensive rebound. That is something that falls on the players. Like Steve Clifford can't do any more than do rebounding drills and tell the team they need to focus and they need to box out. But this is something that the players have not learned to do. Like it's a battle just to get them to do the basics, never mind the more trickier things.
Well, a lot of things that you just mentioned, like turnovers, defensive rebounding, things of that nature do come back to toughness. Like you got to be tough on the ball. You got to be smart with the ball. You got to be able to box out players. You got to have
every play, not just now and then, every single possession, which is this team's problem. They do it for spurts. When things are going well, when the shots are going in, suddenly people are boxing out and they're in the game. But like Orlando, who've been terrible for years before this year, I remember you used to watch them go into Orlando and they'd have won like 10 games and have 30 losses. And you could see them playing with like a level of energy and intensity that was impressive. Mo Wagner would be chirping, playing physical. And you could be like, oh, they're not there yet, but they're playing with something. Charlotte just have a complete absence of that.
You almost wonder if, to your point, it's almost like if their offense is going well, then they'll play hard on defense. I feel like it's got to be the opposite. I feel like you got to play hard on defense regardless, and then if the offense comes, then that's when the stretches come. And I think that's what Clifford's trying to preach. I'm sure he's stressing that in practice. He's trying to get these guys on board, but some of them just don't have it in them to be 100%, 4 quarters, 48 minutes, to be hustling every single possession. This is a team that just can't take quarters off. We've seen the slow starts, and you get that glimmer of hope in the second and third quarter when they try to come back. But at that point, it's too late because you wonder, man, if they had just shown this effort in the first quarter, who knows where they would have been by this point. And then back to your previous point about the young players, about like the intrigue and just kind of being interested in how they are playing. Yeah, there isn't a whole lot, but I also feel as if the team itself was constructed a little bit better and they were coming in not just to, fill in for injured players, but they were coming in just to, have an 8-minute spurt here or there in the game. It's almost like they'd be contributing to a winning team. And I feel like that's when you get a little bit more interested. We now know that Nick Smith Jr. and JT Thor and Bryce McGowan, all these guys are coming in and they're not going to contribute to a winning team. They're just getting out there getting reps because we know overall this team is not going to succeed to where, they probably should succeed at if the roster was built a little bit better. So I think that's why, or at least partly why, like as fans, you just don't get all that excited when NSJ comes in, because it's like, okay, he may put up 6-8 points, but it's not really going to contribute to anything in the overall grand scheme of things.
Yeah, agreed. So we were very close there. You were 25%, I was 30%. I will let you go to the third section here. And from what I think you said before, have you got these two sections split percentage equally?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I got coaching at 10% and I got luck at 10%. So that equals out to 100. I'm assuming my math is correct here. So
yes,
let's just start with coaching. I don't think Steve Clifford is immune from criticism by any means, but I'm just not sure what more he can do from his point of view that would put this team like over the top. He's been dealt a bad hand. Injuries, which we'll talk about here in a second, the lack of depth, the lack of desire, which we just talked about, that want to on the defensive side of the court, and his best players, when healthy, even when healthy, like even when they are healthy, this team just isn't good enough on most nights against most teams. So I do believe that coaching has an effect in the NBA. I wouldn't say that coaching is irrelevant, but I do think it has more of a swing if you're like a top 5 coach or a bottom 5 coach in terms of like up or down. I think a lot of the coaches that are kind of falling in between, they do matter, but I feel they have less of an effect. And I kind of find myself evaluating Clifford anywhere from like, the 17th to 20th, 23rd best coach in the NBA. I haven't sat down and kind of ranked them all, but he's kind of in the middle. And I think just based on pure talent, this team doesn't have it. I think one thing that is really hurting him is like the roster continuity and the playing groups is just not consistent. And Clifford's even mentioned that these guys are playing with different players every single night. And so for that to happen, there's no consistency. And I will say this, like Clifford has been known to get his teams to play better and to overachieve, especially as the season progresses. But I almost got my doubts on that. Like, I feel it's going to be an uphill battle for him come February, March, April, if he's still around. So I'll just say 10% on coaching. I'll pass it over to you. I think there's a lot of things that are out of his control. Could he do better in certain situations? Yes. Obviously, he's very defensive minded and he's not getting this team to perform on that end of the court. I think offensively, he's not a guy that is, in tune to the more progressive and new age offense. I don't think his sets are as particularly, creative as maybe James Borrego. But I think the standard that he's trying to hold these players to is high. Like, obviously, we don't know all the ins and outs of how he handles the players, but I go to practice, like he's saying, all the right things, but I have it down to 10%. I don't know where you have coaching for you.
So I had coaching at 10% as well, but I've changed while listening to you speak, and I actually increased it to 12.5%. The reason being is because
I made a bad case.
Well, no, I know my feeling, I think, was a little bit more critical than yours, but we had the same percentage.
Oh, okay.
So
okay.
I felt like I need to bump mine up a little bit more to reflect that. And also because when we post these 2 pie charts, if we just have the same percentages for everything, it's going to look really stupid. So I take what you say. I understand the criticism, like, the excuse, which is, well, you not have the playing groups. And I get that. Equally, this is the NBA, right? And every team struggles to have the playing groups. You see the Phoenix Suns, you see even the Minnesota Timberwolves have had guys in and out of the lineup. And I know the Charlotte Hornets have probably had it worse than most, but you're never going to have all the guys that you want playing in playing groups for like 3-4 weeks in a row that they all know what each other do. That just very, very rarely happens. So I think I understand why Steve keeps saying that. And if I was a coach, I'd be saying the same thing, but you got to be able to adapt on the fly here because that's what happens in the NBA. I think the coaching for me, the first 15 games is basically what I'm judging off this season because the last 5 to 8, because of injuries, you can throw them away. Like, there is very little you can tell out there when you've got Nathan Mensah guarding Joel Embiid. Like, this is nothing to do with coaching, in my opinion. But in those first 15 games, I think there were a lot of things in there that I thought were red flags for me. Let's start with training camp. And this is something that Steve Clifford, I think Steve Clifford's approach to training camp is pretty outdated. He talks about how he likes to just come in and scrimmage and they do a lot of contact, and how most teams now don't do that. They, put the defense, they put their offense in. But he says it's how the Van Gundys used to do it and guys like it. And I understand why guys like it, right? It's like everyone prefers playing matches than doing training.
Right.
But training is really important. And normally that's what you do. And Steve Clifford's teams have generally started the season poorly over his coaching career. Like, they've got better as the year have gone on. But equally, I think there's something around this team looks unprepared and unorganized early in the season because I don't think they're putting in their offense and their defense early enough, letting their players get adjusted to it. You saw in the start of this season, the shot profile of this team for the first 10 to 15 games was archaic. I mean, they were taking and making the least threes in the NBA by far, and they've gone some way to offset that now. But why does that have to take so long, right? The defensive side of the ball, you look at every defensive metric right now, they're 26th in transition, offense, that is. They're bottom 5 in transition defense, bottom 5 in defense in total, 24th in rebounding, 24th in fouling, 28th in defensive shot profile distribution. There's just not really a good aspect. You talk about Steve Clifford ideology. He's not getting players to execute. And yes, this is the ever long battle between like players and coaches who's responsible. But part of your job as a coach is to be able to communicate things in ways and coach things in a way that land and that the players then can absorb and then execute that. And I think Steve Clifford's identifying the right areas, foul trouble, etc. But we're not seeing progress now in year 2 with a lot of the same players. Some of those very same players who were here last year are making these same issues. So, the rotations don't bother me. I see so many people complaining about rotations the entire time. And just every single coach in the NBA gets flack from their fan base about rotations. There's always some guy they'd rather see over some other guy. For me, it's nothing about rotations. It is about how they're ready to start the season. Some of the, the lack of ability to turn coaching points into reality. Like, you don't see that reaction game to game. You're not seeing that improvement. So that's my big thing from my end. I think I am more concerned, especially this year, about the coaching. I was not impressed with those first 10 games, which is a soft schedule. Yeah. And Charlotte needed to go above 500, and they just did not look ready for the season to start.
Yeah, that is true. Obviously, that was without Miles Bridges as well. So I wonder, if you took that 11th game to like the 20th game to see how those numbers would pan out. But those are all valid points in terms of the coaching. I do have a quick question for you. I mean, this is kind of a sidetrack question. Do you think the Hornets should have ever fired Borrego?
I was on the track record at the time saying no. I was shocked that they did it. I still don't think they should have done it. Look, there was obviously things going on internally there. Like on the surface, it was absolutely bonkers, right? They was at 43 and 39 wins in 2 years, made the play-in, seemed to be going in a good way. LaMelo Ball was playing well. I think there was clearly, for me, the way I always put it is like the players internally I always theorized they didn't have support for James Borrego, because I couldn't see any other reason you would move on from him as a coach unless all of your players were going to your front office or your owner and saying, this guy is not the coach that we need. That was my theory. I still guess I lean on that today. But they've brought in obviously a very clearly a defensive first coach in Steve Clifford since. But let's just be frank, the defense was 20th last year, as it was the year before when James Borrego was here. And this year it's due to be actually the worst defense, worse than any James Borrego era. The weird zones that were introduced were strange, sure, but they were actually kind of effective. And despite finally having a shot blocking rim protector, which this team is crying out for in the James Borrego years, this team has better defensive talent now than James Borrego had, and is a worse defense. So I can't tell you without being in those coaching sessions, like you said, to know exactly what happened. But if I was surprised when they did it, I would have kept James Borrego in place.
No, I lean that way as well. And I think with the new owners, moving forward with the new coach, I think one of the biggest things, and obviously if a coach is not performing or if something like that is happening behind the scenes, you need to make a change. But I think establishing continuity and longevity with a head coach is so important in today's NBA. And so for, Clifford to be, I guess this is his last year of his contract, to know that he's kind of like a lame duck coach. And
the players know it too. I can tell you that right now. The players know that Steve Clifford is not choosing the starting lineup next year. That is just so unlikely to happen. And that kind of stuff matters. When someone's trying to hold you to be accountable, if you know they're not going to be here in a matter of months, like you just take that a little bit less seriously. You just do.
Yeah. But that's not on Clifford, right?
No, absolutely not. That comes back to player responsibility.
Yeah. So I just think that, obviously, you want to pick the best coach for the best, for the players that are on the court, but give the coach a little bit more of a runway to work with, 3-4 years. And I know that the situation with Clifford was so different with the way that they had to hire him last minute, but having that longevity, we talk about longevity and continuity with the players. You need to have that with the coach. I think that's probably one of the most important things to have, just to kind of build that up with the players. So
How would you feel, Richie, Mike Budenholzer, if he was appointed, right? Goes back to Atlanta with Rick Schnell, the current, currently a free agent coach after leaving the Milwaukee Bucks. They would have to pay him a lot of money to come here. He would have to want to come here. But would you be happy with a Mike Budenholzer appointment? Because he was unpopular by the kind of the end in Milwaukee. Like people, playoff Bud was definitely a thing that people criticized. But you talk about a two-way team. That Milwaukee Bucks team was pretty impressive in that side. Really experienced coach. Is that a guy who you think would be of interest?
Yeah. I mean, I think without knowing the other names that would be out there, he obviously has established himself as a guy in the NBA that has proven to work. Obviously, he had Giannis Antetokounmpo to kind of spearhead that offense and kind of put pressure on the rim. I do think that there's some similarities with the way that they can use Mark Williams and Brook Lopez. Obviously, Lopez has a three-point shot that Mark Williams does not have as of now, but on the defensive side of the court, I can see the way that they kind of funnel teams towards Mark Williams and things of that nature. So I think the experience, I think going with the guy that has experience probably would be very beneficial. Part of me wants to know, like, do we get a young and up and coming guy that can kind of relate to the younger guys? But I feel like that's kind of resorting to what the Borrego hire was and using that as a player development hire. So I would not mind getting a guy that has been established in the league for years. And like I said, just make sure that there's some kind of concrete 3-4 year runway that he can have and kind of build that relationship.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay. Luck is our last piece of the pie here. And for you, what percentage was that? That came down to 10 again. Was that right?
10 again. I just split it with coaching. Maybe I should be giving more credit to this section than I am. I know that a lot of fans just want to blame the injuries, and it has been very unlucky for the Hornets in terms of who they've lost. Obviously, if they're losing Bryce McGowens, you don't want to see anyone get injured, but like they've been losing LaMelo Ball, they've been losing Hayward, they've been losing Terry Rozier last year. Like just certain players that are so crucial to this team. I understand that is really affecting this team. But again, it goes back to my original point. If the front office had built a more in-depth team, two-way players from start to finish, from the first man to the 15th man, I think the Hornets would be doing better and teams overcome a little bit of unlucky situations. So I'm not denying that the Hornets have had injuries. They've had plenty of injuries to key players. I just didn't put too much credit into this because I think people that, if they had put this like at 50%, I think you're just using that as an excuse. And I kind of
completely agree.
Yeah, put that off to the side. Let's not just use injuries as an excuse. Maybe it could go higher, 15, 20, but I kind of settled in at 10. I don't really have much analysis on this section just because it's so hard to gauge.
Yeah, I had this down at 2.5%. So if you think I'm someone thinking, we're just unlucky, I'm definitely not on that side of the bandwagon. One thing I will say is, like, can you sign Gordon Hayward and then claim him being injured is unlucky?
Right.
That's a question, right? And I think there's some other things out here, like LaMelo Ball obviously has various ankle injuries. I'm not saying ankle braces would have stopped it, but like he could have kept wearing them. And is that unlucky when something like that happens? Re-signing Bridges, him missing 10 games, is that unlucky or is that a front office decision? So, like, obviously these people just going up and landing on ankles, these are all things that you can't control and are unlucky. But I agree with you. We saw enough in those first like 10 games, even with LaMelo Ball playing at the level he was at. This team, it's not like it was, 5-2 with LaMelo Ball playing well. It was still battling to even stay in touch to be 500. So I'm still just of the thought that this team has too many players that just do not complement one another's strengths and weaknesses well enough. Cody Martin is the big one. I think that is unlucky. You re-sign him to that contract. He is your energy spark plug, tough two-way player, and he is essentially out for a huge period of time. And that is something that no one could have foreseen at the time, right? I guess another thing to argue here is, the Hornets got lucky moving up in the draft lottery, right? If you want to go back to there. So you could actually argue with moving up, selecting LaMelo Ball, moving up, selecting Brandon Miller. You could argue that Mitch Kupchak's been very lucky in his period. He's never moved down in the lottery. He's only moved up into top 3 picks twice. That is some extremely good luck. Now, I know that's not just the season, but if anyone wants to write the last, couple of years off just to, poor luck, I think, like you say, you are hiding behind facts that you don't want to face, that there has been organizational failures, which we talked about throughout this episode, spread around the organization.
Yeah. And they even got lucky in the fact that Golden State drafted Wiseman. Like, what would this team look like today if Wiseman was on the roster?
And the Pelicans pick that they got, when they made the play-in from the Devontae Graham trade, which came in to be, what was it, pick 15, because they made the 8th seed. In the end, they came in through the play-in tournament, and then they ended up using that on Mark Williams and trading their own pick which was Duran, into whatever those Nick Smith Jr., Bryce McGowan's, and other pieces which got traded. So again, like, that's another one. Like, that pick could not have conveyed any more valuable than it did. Which is, it would have become, I think, 2 seconds, maybe the year after or the year after that. So there's been a lot of things that have actually perfectly gone Charlotte Hornets' way. Even like the weak start to the season, that soft schedule to start when they had no Miles Bridges. Mm-hmm. What a dream that is, right? Get off to a good start. And that didn't happen either. So I think, I'm not blaming luck at all on this season. There is a small element of injuries. I think there would be, I don't know what the record is right now off the top of my head, but I think they would have won probably like 3 or 4 more games, 2 or 3 more games if they weren't. But I still don't think this team was going anywhere, and these issues still exist.
Yeah, that's a good way to put a bow on this conversation. I'll go ahead and recap my percentages. It's interesting. You did I know you did it last second, but you added like a non-multiple of 5 there with that 12%, which was pretty cool. I was only going multiple of 5, but so 55% for front office for me, 25% for players, and then I just split the last 20%, 10-10 into luck, into coaching.
Yeah, and I had players at 30, front office at 55, coaching at 12.5, and luck at 2.5%. Very similar generally as we went through. So Richie, thanks for coming on and going through this exercise. I know you have to escape to dad duties, and so do I. So appreciate you giving up your time. I hope you have a great holiday with you and your family of 4 now. And we will link back up, I'm sure, in the new year at some point.
Very good. Thanks for the invitation. This exercise was pretty cool. So it's content that I think the Hornets fans will definitely enjoy.
Anytime. Thanks, Richie.